Welcome, dear listener, to a book written by a man who spent his entire life trying to answer one simple question. Why do some people get what they want out of life, while others, often just as capable, never seem to break free of struggle and disappointment? The author is Orison Swett Marden, one of the great voices of the early self-help and New Thought movement in America. Marden's own story is remarkable in itself. He was orphaned as a small child, raised in poverty, passed from one relative to another, and worked brutal hours on farms as a boy. But somewhere along the way, he got hold of a book by Samuel Smiles, and something in him woke up. He went on to earn multiple degrees, run several successful hotels, and then, after losing nearly everything in the Great Boston Fire of 1893, he turned to writing full-time, eventually founding Success Magazine and authoring dozens of books meant to help ordinary people believe in their own possibilities. This particular book, published in 1917, is called How to Get What You Want. It sits right in the thick of the First World War, a moment when Marden saw both extraordinary courage and extraordinary despair around him, and it shows in these pages. He writes about faith, about the hidden power of the mind, about discouragement as a genuine disease with genuine cure, and about what he calls our partnership with God. Underneath all of it runs one central conviction, that we are, every one of us, carrying around vastly more power than we have ever used, and that the whole art of living well is learning how to unlock it. So let's settle in together, and let Marden show us what he means. There's an old fable Marden opens with about a lion cub who becomes separated from his mother in the forest and is found, frightened and alone, by a mother sheep who has just lost her own lamb. She adopts him, and he grows up believing in every way that he is a sheep. He trembles at the sight of dogs. He flees from wolves. He has no idea there is anything different about him at all. Then one day, a full-grown lion appears on a distant hilltop and lets out a tremendous roar. Something in the cub stirs that has never stirred before. A new feeling floods through him, and almost without thinking, he answers the roar with one of his own. Then, trembling with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, he bounds off toward the hill, and he never returns to the sheepfold again. Marden's point here is direct and personal. There is a sleeping lion in every one of us, he says. It's simply a question of something happening that arouses it, that stirs the depths of our being and reveals the power that was there all along. Once a person discovers they are more than mere clay, more than an ordinary creature of habit and circumstance, they can never again be satisfied with a small, cramped, low-flying kind of life. Marden gives us example after example of this awakening happening to real people. A poor Italian boy working as a kitchen scullion catches his first glimpse of a great painting, and something ignites in him, and he cries out, "I too am a painter," and goes on to study under a master and eventually surpass him. He tells us of a young Charles Schwab, who at one point in his career would have laughed at the very idea of the man he would later become. He reminds us of Saul the persecutor, struck down on a road to Damascus by a light from heaven, rising again as Paul, the very apostle of faith he once tried to destroy. What all of these stories share, Marden insists, is that nothing was actually added to these people in that moment of awakening. The power was already there, waiting. The roar of the lion on the hillside, the painting in the studio, the light on the road, these things did not create new strength. They simply revealed strength that already existed, hidden and unused. And once a person has truly seen the hidden power in themselves, even once, they can never again be fully content to live as though they were merely a sheep. Marden believes this is really the heart of what he calls the new philosophy of his day, this blend of new thought and practical psychology that was sweeping the country. Its whole purpose, he says, is to help us discover this undiscovered part of ourselves, the part buried under doubt, timidity, fear, and worry, and to show us that when we finally believe in our own divine origin, we simply cannot go on being satisfied with cheap and common success. Having opened this door, Marden turns immediately to the practical question every reader really wants answered. How, exactly, do we go about getting what we want? His central image here is the magnet, a piece of magnetized steel. He reminds us only attracts iron. It has no pull whatsoever on wood or copper or rubber. Human beings, Marden says, work exactly the same way. We are constantly drawing to ourselves, through our thoughts and our expectations, the very things and people that correspond to what dominates our minds. Our circumstances, our associates, our whole situation in life are the direct result of what he calls our mental attraction. If you fill your mind with fear of poverty, with worry, with a constant expectation of failure, Marden warns, you'll inevitably draw squalid surroundings and disappointing company to yourself, as surely as a magnet draws iron filings. But think clearly and persistently about the things you actually want. Hold that picture with all the force of your mind and struggle toward it with real effort, and you become a magnet for exactly those things instead. He tells the story of the actor Clifton Crawford, who was bluntly told early in his American career that his work simply wasn't good enough and that he should go back home to Scotland. Crawford ignored the advice, held fast to his own inner vision of himself, and went on to become a genuine Broadway star. Marden's point is that Crawford won out because he related himself mentally to the thing he wanted, rather than to the pessimistic voices around him. There's a phrase Marden returns to again and again in this chapter, borrowed loosely from the poet Lowell. The thing we long for, that we are, for one transcendent moment. Marden's whole argument is that the men and women who accomplish great things are simply the ones who learn to make that transcendent moment permanent, rather than letting it slip away as a fleeting daydream. The architect, he points out, does not merely look at his blueprint. In his mind, he already sees a completed building standing before him in every detail. It's this invisible structure, built first in imagination, that eventually becomes brick and steel in the physical world. Your own future, Marden tells us, is being built the very same way, right now, by the thoughts you allow yourself to hold today. He walks us through the stories of the great inventors here. Goodyear and his vulcanized rubber, Morse and his telegraph, Cyrus Field and his ocean cable, Eli Whitney and his cotton gin, Alexander Graham Bell and his telephone. In every single case, he says, these men clung to a vision that the world around them called impossible, foolish, even insane, and it was precisely their unshakable fixity of purpose, not their circumstances, that eventually made the impossible real. Now, Marden turns from ambition to something gentler, but, in his view, just as essential, and that is happiness itself. He calls this chapter Playing the Glad Game, and he opens with an account from a man recovering from surgery who experienced, quite unexpectedly, 20 minutes of what felt like pure transcendent reality, in which every ordinary thing around him, every sparrow, every branch tossed in the wind, suddenly appeared soaked in almost unbearable beauty and joy. If it's possible to feel that way for 20 minutes, Marden asks, why should it not be possible to feel that way always? He tells the old story of a boy who lives in a poor little hilltop cottage and who is captivated every evening by the sight of a beautiful house far off in the valley, its windows blazing gold in the setting sun. Certain that real happiness must live in that distant house, the boy finally makes the long, dusty journey to find it, only to discover, when he arrives, that it is nothing but a broken-down old barn with dirty, cracked windows. Heartbroken, he turns to look back the way he came, and there, in the far distance, catching the very same setting sun, his own humble little cottage on a hilltop is blazing with the same beautiful golden light. This, Marden says, is exactly the mistake most of us make our entire lives. We assume happiness is always somewhere else, in some other house, some future circumstance, some further achievement, when in reality it was glowing quietly in our own present moment the entire time, if only we had known how to see it. He is quite firm on this point. Happiness cannot be bought. It is not found in food or drink or fine clothing, or an endless round of pleasure and excitement. Happiness, he insists, is born of right living, of right thinking, of helpful, unselfish service. He tells of a family who came into a small windfall of money and, rather than quietly enjoying their good fortune, became consumed with envy of wealthier neighbors, straining to keep up appearances they could not afford, until the whole thing ended in financial ruin and the loss of the very home they had once been content in. Marden is especially critical here of what he saw as the old, gloomy strain of religious teaching, which pushed all joy and reward off into some distant future life, and treated play and laughter with deep suspicion, almost as signs of sinfulness. He much prefers the spirit of the new philosophy of his day, which insisted that innocent joy and gladness are just as religious, just as essential to our well-being as prayer itself. He reminds us that the Bible itself tells us, again and again, to rejoice and be glad, and he suspects, with a touch of dry humor, that if we're told this 800 times, the message is probably meant seriously. Now, before Marden takes us into darker territory, let's pause here for just a moment. If this walk through his ideas about attraction, ambition, and gladness is giving you something worth carrying into your own day, consider subscribing to the channel, so these kind of reflections keep finding their way to you at the same natural pace. Now, let's continue on into what Marden considers one of the gravest dangers a person can face. He calls this next chapter discouragement of disease, and he means that quite literally, not as a figure of speech. He opens with a sobering statistic that hundreds of people take their own lives in New York City alone every year. And that discouragement, in nearly every single case, lies at the root of it. He tells of a young musician so despondent over his lack of success and the pawning of his beloved violin that he saw no way forward at all. Discouragement, Marden argues, functions exactly like smallpox or scarlet fever, except that it attacks the mind rather than the body, and it is, if anything, more dangerous because it so often drives its victims toward ruin, toward drink, toward crime, toward complete collapse. The moment we yield to it, every one of our mental faculties becomes depressed and disorganized. Our judgment weakens. Our courage, which Marden calls a true leader among all our mental faculties, goes into retreat, and every other faculty retreats along with it. He shares a striking story here of a young businessman, ruined by the outbreak of the war, sitting despondently on a bench in Madison Square, trying to decide how to wind up his failed affairs. A ragged, broken-down tramp sits beside him, and in the course of their conversation, the tramp reveals that he was once an educated, prosperous man himself, until a single business failure led him to drink for temporary courage, a habit that slowly destroyed him entirely. But you, the tramp tells the young man, still have your youth, your health, your strength, and there is no failure that cannot be redeemed. Only quitting after failure is truly disgraceful. The young man walks away from that encounter transformed, and years later attributes much of his eventual success to that unlikely meeting. Marden's remedy for this disease of discouragement is direct, personal, spoken affirmation. He urges us to speak to ourselves, quite literally out loud, addressing ourselves by name, and to say something like this: "The truth of my being is God, and I was never intended to express doubt or despondency. I am victory organized. I was made to win, not to be defeated. Discouragement has no real power over me, because it is not a reality at all, merely a passing shadow, a ghost of the imagination." From this inward battle against despair, Marden moves next to what he calls a force that moves mountains, meaning faith itself. He tells the biblical story of David and Goliath here with real relish, pointing out that David refused even to wear the heavy armor offered to him, because his true confidence lay not in weapons of steel, but in the strength of his own conviction. Faith, Marden insists, is not guessing or hoping. It sees the way out clearly, even through what looks, to everyone else, like an impossible mountain of difficulty. He recounts the story of Joan of Arc, an untrained peasant girl who nonetheless led a defeated army to victory through nothing but the unshakable force of her own conviction, and the story of Columbus, whose sailors threatened him with mutiny, yet who kept writing the very same line in his log day after day: "This day we sailed west because it was our course," because it was quite simply nothing else for a man of his conviction to do. Marden shares an interesting scientific note here as well, describing an experiment showing that the same muscle in an athlete's arm, tested immediately after death, could support only a small fraction of the weight it had supported just moments earlier in life. The difference, he argues, was entirely a matter of the athlete's own confidence and belief in his strength. Our faith in ourselves, he suggests, functions like a kind of cable connecting us to a much greater source of power, and the larger that cable, the more of that power we are able to draw upon and express in our own lives. Marden pairs this discussion of faith directly with a chapter on what he provocatively calls faith in drugs, in which he takes on the medical practices of his day quite boldly. He shares accounts of surgeons performing entirely fake operations, complete with anesthesia and bandages, on patients so convinced they were suffering from some serious ailment that no amount of reassurance could convince them otherwise. In every case he describes, the patient recovered completely, healed not by any actual surgery, but by their own restored belief that they had been healed. He tells of pilgrims bathing in the visibly filthy waters of the Ganges River during a great festival, waters that by any ordinary medical standard should cause illness rather than cured it. And yet many of these deeply devoted pilgrims were, in fact, healed. The cure, Marden insists, was never in the water itself, any more than it is ever truly in the pill or the potion. The cure is always, in every single case, a matter of the sufferer's own faith. Christ himself, Marden reminds us, never once claimed the healing power as his own. His words were always the same: "According to thy faith be it unto thee. Thy faith hath made thee whole." Now Marden turns to a question just as urgent as any other in this book, and that is simply, how do we find ourselves in the first place? He opens this chapter with a lovely little legend that when the Creator was equipping humanity for his long journey through life, an attending angel wanted to add the gift of complete contentment and satisfaction, and the Creator stopped him, saying that to bestow such a thing would rob every person forever the great joy of discovering themselves. Marden compares us here to the humble acorn, which already contains, folded up within its small and unremarkable shell, absolutely everything needed to become a towering, magnificent oak tree. A stunted, twisted little scrub oak, he says, is not a failure of the acorn's original design, but simply the result of poor soil, poor conditions that prevented the acorn's full potential from ever fully unfolding. The very same principle, he insists, applies to every single human being ever born. He tells us of Ulysses Grant, a man who at nearly 40 years of age had shown absolutely no sign of the greatness that lay hidden within him, drifting through one mediocre job after another, a comparative failure by any ordinary measure, until the shock and emergency of the Civil War finally called forth the extraordinary military genius that had been sleeping inside him the entire time, entirely unsuspected. All those years. Marden's advice for uncovering this hidden self in our own lives is refreshingly practical. Read the world's great books. Listen closely to inspiring speakers. Seek out music, art, and noble company. Above all, keep growing, keep reaching, because self-discovery, he insists, is never a single one-time event, but rather a continuous, lifelong unfolding, very much like Emerson's famous observation that most people, sadly, never truly find themselves before they die. From self-discovery, Marden moves naturally into a chapter on how we might attract genuine prosperity into our lives. Here he offers us a memorable little parable about a poor woman moving into her very first electrically lit home, astonished by the small light of an ordinary 8-candle power bulb, having never seen anything like it before in her life. When a salesman later replaces her small bulb with a much larger 60-candle power one, just to demonstrate its light, she is utterly transfixed, never once realizing that the very same electrical current, the very same limitless supply, had been available to her the entire time. She had simply never thought to ask for more of it. This, Marden says, is exactly how most of us live our entire lives, drawing only the smallest trickle from what is, in truth, an unlimited supply of opportunity and abundance, simply because our own thoughts, our doubts, our fears, our habitual expectation of lack pinch the supply pipe down to almost nothing. Prosperity, he insists, follows a law every bit as exact and dependable as mathematics or basic physics. Obey that law by genuinely thinking, expecting, and working toward abundance, and the supply will flow freely toward you. Choke it off instead with constant worry and self-doubt, and you will remain limited to your own small 8-candle bulb, wondering all the while why brighter and richer lives always seem to belong only to other people. From here, Marden takes us into what may be the most genuinely fascinating chapter in the entire book, one he simply calls Thinking All Over. Drawing on the cutting-edge science of his day, Marden argues that intelligence itself is not confined only to the brain, but is actually distributed throughout every single living cell in the entire body. He cites Thomas Edison's own memorable observation that every cell in us thinks, and Professor Nell's cleverly related theory that each individual cell possesses its own genuine intelligence and consciousness, all of these countless cells working together in a vast, coordinated, and remarkably harmonious community. This means, Marden argues, that our thoughts and emotions are never confined merely to our heads. A wave of despair or a burst of joy travels instantly through every single cell in the entire body, shaping our health, our vitality, and our very resistance to disease. He tells us that surgeons have observed how the wounds of soldiers from a victorious army heal noticeably faster than those from a defeated one, a striking testament to just how deeply our mental state affects our actual physical healing. The clear, practical lesson Marden draws from all of this is that we must learn to consciously radiate healthy, hopeful, and encouraging thoughts through our entire being, rather than discouraged, fearful thoughts so many of us default to without ever noticing. Just as we would never get the very best work out of an employee we constantly criticize and distrusted, Marden says, we will never get the best functioning out of our own stomach, our own heart, our own nerves, if we constantly complain about them and expect them to fail us. This naturally leads Marden into a chapter of genuinely practical exercises, which he calls heart-to-heart talks with yourself. He urges us to set aside real time, in real privacy, to speak to ourselves quite literally out loud, by name, honestly examining our own particular strengths and weaknesses, exactly as we might do for a dear friend or a beloved younger sibling we truly want to help. He shares a moving wartime example here, describing how French soldiers at the terrible Battle of Verdun were sustained, in part by the simple, endlessly repeated phrase, "They shall not pass," a phrase so deeply absorbed into their minds through constant repetition that it became, quite literally, an unshakable, driving conviction. Marden urges us to build our own version of that same phrase, our own personal unshakable declarations, repeated daily with real conviction, to drive out our own particular fears, our own particular bad habits, our own particular self-doubts. And finally, in his closing chapter, Marden brings every single thread of this book together under what he calls our partnership with God. He argues here that the very same creative intelligence that first designed the entire universe is not somehow locked away somewhere distant and separate from us, but is instead actively alive and present in every single cell of our own bodies, in every atom of matter around us. When we genuinely realize this deep and fundamental oneness, Marden says, we stop feeling like helpless, isolated victims of blind circumstance and fate, and start feeling instead like active, conscious partners working directly alongside the very same power that first shaped the stars themselves. He points to figures like Thomas Edison and the great plant breeder Luther Burbank as vivid living proof of this partnership already at work all around us, men who felt, in their own words, more like receiving channels for a much greater creative intelligence than like the sole, isolated originators of their own remarkable discoveries. This partnership, Marden insists firmly, is never a one-sided or free arrangement. To genuinely keep God as your active partner, he says, you must be honest, you must be clean and pure-minded, you must be kind and considerate toward absolutely everyone around you, because a partnership of this kind simply cannot survive on dishonesty or on any form of real cruelty. But once you have genuinely secured that partnership, Marden promises, you no longer need to fear want or failure or even death itself, because you know, beyond any real doubt, that you are permanently united with a power that nothing in this world can ever truly overcome. And so, dear listener, we come to the very end of Orison Swett Marden's How to Get What You Want. We've walked together through the sudden roar that awakens the sleeping lion within each of us, through the quiet, magnetic pull of our own deepest thoughts and expectations, through the simple but profound art of finding gladness exactly where we already stand, through the genuine disease of discouragement and its equally genuine cure, through the mountain-moving force of real faith, through the deep, patient work of finally finding our own true and larger selves, through the natural laws that quietly govern genuine prosperity, through the surprising cellular reach of our own thoughts and moods, and finally, into that deep and steady partnership with the very source of all creative power. If there is one single thread running through absolutely everything Marden has shared with us today, it is simply this: The very thing you long for is never nearly as far away as it seems. The power to reach it was never missing from you in the first place. It was only ever waiting patiently for you to finally believe in it and then to claim it as genuinely your own. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and with Orison Swett Marden. If these ideas gave you something worth carrying forward into your own life, please consider subscribing to the channel so these kinds of journeys keep finding their way to you. Until next time, believe boldly in your own hidden strength, and I will see you in the next one